Fascism. Ah! Fascists everywhere. There's a fascist. There's another fascist. That person might be a proto-fascist, or maybe even a crypto-fascist. Yes, fascists. On the roof, under the bed, in political office? These are just some of the thoughts I have on an hourly basis, but it's not all internalized paranoia, and that's because far-right populism appears to be on the rise again. Thanks for nothing, Hungary, and Brazil, and America. But given that we know where far-right politics have led in the past, should we be doing anything to stop those politics from spreading before they can do their inevitable damage? Should politics based on violence, lies, and hatred be allowed? Should people who inspire terrorists face any consequences? Dare we tolerate the intolerant? Or should we limit your free speech? Part 1. Mr. Popper's Penguins. Paradox. Mr. Popper's Paradox. For those who don't already know, Popper's Paradox wasn't just the best Saturday morning cartoon to never exist. It was also the theoretical brain spillings of Austrian philosopher Karl Popper, who posited that in order for a society to be truly tolerant, it must not tolerate intolerance. If that strikes you as counterintuitive, congratulations. Not only are you able to correctly identify a paradox, you're probably also not a supercomputer AI from a 1970s British science fiction television show.
Really? Then try this one. If I were to tell you that the next thing I say will be true, but that the last thing I said was a lie, would you believe me?
The matter is not relevant.
Check.
However, it can be worked out. Yes.
Go on.
Let's kick off with a little thought experiment just to get our brains in gear. Don't worry, I'll do all the work. Let's say there's an ethnic group of people. We'll call them, the Doos. And some of these Doos live in the totally fictional country of Bermany. The Doos have lived in Bermany for a long time, but things haven't always been perfect. There have historically been anti-Doomitic attitudes bubbling away under the surface, but for the most part people get on. Now, for one reason or another, this fictional country of Bermany goes through an economically turbulent time, and things get pretty rough for a lot of the people there. And some clever dick comes along and says he wants to blame not just all of Bermany's problems on the Doos, but all of the world's problems as well. If you vote for me, he says, I'll do something about the problem of the Doos. I'll implement a solution. Now, most people would say, let's not pay any attention to this obviously silly person. But some other people start to pay attention. Maybe because they're getting pretty desperate due to the economically turbulent time. Or maybe they've always just been a little bit of a shit. Or maybe because that clever dick blaming the Doos sounds pretty authoritative and makes a good case, actually. Lots of the things he's saying resonate with me and my personal experiences. And that old guy at the back of the beer hall's been banging on about the Doos for years now, so, maybe there's something to it. And before you know it, it's 10 years later, and millions of Doos have been stripped of their human rights and shipped to concentration camps where they're used as forced labour before eventually being systematically murdered on an industrial scale the likes of which the world has never seen before. Now, if you're not a nasty person, you might think to yourself, well, there's a lesson to be learned here from old Bermany, which remember is a fictional country for the purposes of this thought exercise. You might think to yourself, the lesson to be learned is, don't let people like Clever Dick anywhere near power, because Clever Dick not only lied to get into power, he used intimidation and coercion, false flag operations, powerful rhetorical speeches, propaganda and misinformation, among a whole host of other sneaky tricks, all in service of getting into power so that he could do some very nasty things to people he didn't like. In fact, it's probably best to not even allow Clever Dick to get to the point where he could be given any influence over society at all. And what about today? What about where you live? Let's say you saw some modern version of Clever Dick spewing hatred, promoting a narrative that neatly packages all of society's problems into a few simple scapegoats, preaching the same sort of intolerance but maybe with a slightly different spin or sheen? When would you say it's time to step in and stop this new clever dick? As soon as you hear what they're saying? As soon as they try to run for political office? What about when they're already in political office and have the power? Is it too late when they start locking up children in cages? Lots of people stood up against Clever Dick back in Germany. That didn't work out. Maybe when intolerance rears its head, we as a society shouldn't tolerate that. This all forms the basis of Popper's paradox. I'll read the whole thing out because it's not that long and it's often stripped down to a sentence or paraphrased or decontextualized. And it's actually a pretty interesting piece of writing because it's not like he wrote a whole book about it or anything. It's just a footnote, something he decided to keep out of the main body of the text. And yet, it's probably the thing he's most famous for now. Here it is. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force. For it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right to not tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or to kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. This is pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. Chief among them is that in Popper's own words, this is not an argument for suppressing freedom of speech or discussion at all. In fact, he states from the get-go that rational counter-arguments should be deployed in order to keep the most hateful and dumb ideas at bay. However, he acknowledges that rational debate doesn't always work. Clever dicks will not always play by the same rules as everyone else. When they go low, they often win. The main criticism of Popper's paradox seems to be that in order to effectively fight fascism, we have to employ the tactics of fascism. But that's a complete misunderstanding of, well, everything. In fact, it's so asinine a suggestion that it doesn't even bear thinking about. So, we won't. Well, maybe we will later. Popper says we should be prepared to discuss ideas of intolerance, but be ready to shut their butts down when it crosses a line. Now where that line is, and who enforces it when it's crossed, is the contentious part. Part 2. Silence of the hams. Authoritarians, demagogues, fascists, and all-around bad people will abuse the freedoms that have been hard-fought through generations to further their own ends. We've seen it happen. I used the fictional example of Germany earlier to make a point, but we know that in reality, in the 1930s, the historically very real Nazi Party took advantage of free speech to spread their message. They bludgeoned their way into the public consciousness and ultimately into power, only to massively limit freedoms of speech as soon as they got that power. They claimed for years that they were being censored, maligned, and silenced, only to instigate state censorship on a massive scale as soon as they came to power, by holding book-burning rallies, controlling the press, and sending anyone who voiced what they regarded as unacceptable political opinions to concentration camps. They established a ministry of propaganda to control all forms of mass communication in Germany, and they had the audacity to say that they were the ones being silenced. Talk about projection. Today we see figures in, adjacent to, and associated with the modern far right using these exact same tactics, complaining that they're being silenced, right down to using the same tropes to convey their point. The images flashing on your screen right now are people who say they're currently being censored. Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that I slipped in one image there that was from a little bit before the other ones. That's right, it was noted failed painter Adolf Hitler appearing in a propaganda poster with his mouth taped over to indicate how he was being silenced. Good grief! Hitler's being silenced by the powers that be? Oh, well, Hitler wouldn't lie about something so serious. Maybe we should allow him a platform because whatever he's got to say must be worth listening to if the man doesn't want us to hear it. Of course, that's a very silly conclusion to draw, not least because what Hitler had to say led to one of the worst periods in human history. But was Hitler censored? Well, Weimar Germany had some of the most lax attitudes towards freedom of speech that the world has ever seen. In fact, freedom of speech was enshrined in the Republic's constitution. There were some provisions in Weimar law against anti-Semitism, but, call me crazy, I don't think they were very effective. The idea that Hitler could have been somehow censored when he was able to write fucking Mein Kampf while in prison just goes to show the extent that he was allowed to take advantage of the system to further his own ends. Remember, Hitler wasn't sent to prison because he said some bad things. He was sent to prison because he tried to overthrow the government. He came out of prison more popular than ever, a martyr for his cause, a lone warrior battling a censorious government. Now, I'm not saying look where these lax free speech laws got the Weimar Republic, but, come on. Earlier this year, a number of prominent pundits and activists were banned from Facebook. This, as you might expect, generated a fair share of indignation and cries of censorship and infringements on freedom of speech. Among those banned from the platform was one Paul Joseph Watson, the editor-at-large of noted fake news and conspiracy theory website Infowars.com, who claimed that his ban was issued solely on the grounds that he'd once interviewed a far-right politician. This was a lie, or to be more generous, a grotesque distortion of events, which coincidentally is Paul's specialty. In papers purportedly leaked to Breitbart News, it's detailed that Paul was banned for breaking Facebook's community standards by allegedly using the platform to spread hateful content, of which one example was his interview with a far-right politician. In a statement to The Atlantic magazine, Facebook said, "We've always banned individuals or organizations that promote or engage in violence and hate, regardless of ideology." From the way Watson presents his ban from Facebook, you could be forgiven for thinking that it happened solely on the grounds that he interviewed someone once. But that wasn't why he was banned. It was an alleged deeply worrying pattern of behavior that got him booted, not one incident devoid of all context. This from Breitbart. Paul Joseph Watson eventually was categorized as hateful and banned from the platform, in part, and that's my emphasis by the way, in part because he praised a far-right activist and interviewed him on his YouTube channel. Now, it should be noted that I'm citing this article from Breitbart not because I necessarily believe its contents, because Breitbart's a pretty slippery source. No, I'm citing it because it's the evidence that Paul refers to when he talks about being banned for interviewing someone once. But the evidence doesn't support what he says. This means that Paul can't even represent Breitbart News accurately, which should get the old alarm bells ringing. Paul loves hamming it up. He thrives on the idea of him being silenced in spite of having one of the largest platforms in the world, broadcasting to an audience of millions how silenced he is. It gives him something to moan about. It makes him look like a martyr for his cause, a lone warrior battling a censorious government, a failed painter. Oh wait, that's not right. Paul isn't a painter. Whoops. Paul also likes to make reference to George Orwell's novel 1984, in which freedom of speech is crushed and objective truth controlled by a central all-powerful government. In the book, the protagonist Winston writes in his secret diary that freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4. And that's pretty powerful stuff. In a world of misinformation and controlled media where all of history is constantly being rewritten and it's impossible to know reality from fiction, the act of stating a simple mathematical fact is a powerful, subversive act. But actually, if you think about it, freedom is just as much to say that 2 + 2 = 5. It's just that if you choose to say it, it doesn't mean you're right. But if you do say 2 + 2 = 5, and you convince someone that it's the truth, well, that could have disastrous consequences. Let's say you're an engineer and you convince a builder that by your calculations, if you detonate the explosives 5 miles west of the mine shaft because 2 + 2 = 5, and they do that, and a sinkhole opens and swallows up a town, yeah, I mean, you have the freedom to say that, but you were wrong to say it. And by knowingly spreading a lie, by exercising what you might say is your freedom of speech, your being wrong has had some terrible consequences. Or let's say you were to use your influential platform to spread the idea that Muslims are a real problem in society, and you did this consistently over the course of years, and then someone takes it upon themselves to go into a mosque and shoot some Muslims to death. Again, you have the freedom to say the things you say, but your right to say that Muslims are a problem doesn't mean that you're correct, just like the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 5 isn't correct. And if you demand a platform from which to compel people that 2 + 2 = 5, well, that makes you more like Big Brother, using lies and misinformation to distort reality to how you want it to be, getting your fan base riled up every day as a form of 2-minute hate. Hold on, doesn't Paul run a site called Summit News? That's a news peak, a news speak. Anyway, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Hey, what's that? It's time for a word from our sponsor. Okay. When I need a sustainable burst of soy, I just take 2 capsules of Brian Fast Ploop. Scientists might say that it's the most effective way of getting your recommended daily dose of soy, because so many of its active ingredients contain or are directly derived from soy. So if you want loads of soy, if you truly want to be a soy boy, you'll definitely want to buy some of this product, which is called Brian Fast Ploop. Please buy Brian Fast Ploop. Brian Fast Ploop contains massive amounts of soy and is legally distinct from another powerful soy-based nootropic whose name definitely is an anagram of 4 Republicans. Part 3. The private sector. Well-meaning, but also evil? A few months after Facebook banned Paul Joseph Watson and a handful of other tools, YouTube disabled a number of channels on its platform that it alleged were producing far-right political content. This included a channel run by a man named Martin Sellner. Sellner's a particularly dull person, but he's a leading figure in Generation Identity, the Austrian offshoot of the so-called identitarian movement, which is a far-right political movement fiercely opposed to Muslim migrants. They claim that Muslims are a threat to European identity, whatever that is, and that they will eventually replace the indigenous white populations of Europe. Although they insist they're not neo-Nazis, it is with a dull, almost Scooby-Doo-like regularity that every few weeks another member of the identitarian movement is revealed to have close ties to neo-Nazis, or is an outright neo-Nazi themselves. Sellner himself is no stranger to this, having been shown to have links with neo-Nazis and been in direct contact with a New Zealand mosque shooter who he also accepted money from and said if he was ever in town they should get a beer together. YouTube later apparently decided to reverse this decision and reinstated Sellner's account. But here's a wild idea, YouTube. Maybe standing up to people who are literally fascists is a good thing. So Sellner was banned because it's pretty clear that he's a fascist. An actual fascist, not just someone you're disagreeing with on Twitter. Now the argument goes that we don't need to agree with people like Sellner, but that we should respect their right to speak. Because when people see how silly their ideas are, they will laugh at them, and the fascist will shrink with embarrassment and go away forever. We should challenge their ideas. Get them out in the open and reveal how silly they are. Hooray! Fascism is gone. We beat it with discourse this time. Really though? Are you serious? With the benefit of historical hindsight? Honestly? Knowing where fascism leads, you want to give them a platform on which they can spread their ideas? Their ideas which can't be rationally debated because they don't operate within the realms of rational thinking? So when we see people like Sellner pushing the rhetoric of fascism today, maybe it's right and proper to step in sooner and ensure they can't spread their views. Maybe deplatforming people who spread hatred and intolerance is a good thing. Extremists will always find places to gather together. No ideas can ever truly be suppressed, and I'm not advocating against controlling private conversations, but if the people trying to spread hateful ideas are refused a platform as public as, say, social media or national news, it stands to reason that fewer people will become exposed to their ideas, rhetoric, and recruitment tactics. It would help to take their talking points back out of the mainstream after they've tried so hard, and I might add successfully, to put them into the mainstream. You can debunk fascism without inviting a fascist to the table. In Britain, about 10 years ago, the leader of a far-right political party took part in a debate on national television. He was made to look like a racist fool, which is what he is, and his party suffered a crushing defeat at the polls in the election a few months later. After their defeat at the ballot box, this far-right party basically became a non-entity. This is often hailed as some sort of modern-day victory over fascism. Hooray, we laughed at the fascist on TV and now fascism is gone forever. What actually happened was that this fascist party secured almost 500,000 votes nationwide, 3 times as many votes as they'd secured in the previous general election, and more than they'd ever secured at any election ever. They were given an enormous platform to spread their fascist ideas, and those ideas, and the rhetoric they were packaged in, resonated with a lot of people in this country, and the controversy generated and perpetuated by the media subsequent to that appearance gave them even more publicity. Now you might think I'm being alarmist or hyperbolic calling this particular political party fascist, but here's a clip of the leader of that party giving a talk in America, sharing a stage with the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, David Duke.
Nick Griffin spoke at a private meeting of white nationalists in Texas. We've obtained a video of the speech. Beside Mr. Griffin sat David Duke. Mr. Duke is a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization with a violent history of lynchings and murders of blacks. Nick Griffin confided in his right-wing audience that he and his party had a new strategy to sell their ideas to the British people.
There's a difference between selling out your ideas and selling your ideas. And the British National Party isn't about selling out its ideas, which are your ideas too.
Our ideas are your ideas. Very interesting. And remember, this is the same man who appeared on that televised debate we mentioned. The gist of the talk is about how these days you can't just come out and say, we are fascist and want to do fascist things. You have to couch your ideas in softer language, make things more vague and elusive so that people you want to share your ideas with will be able to pick up on what you're saying. But you can also plausibly deny being a fascist because you're not explicitly saying what you mean. For example, instead of saying, I hate foreigners because I'm a racist, you could say, our country needs stronger borders. Or instead of saying, the idea of a mixed-race couple disgusts me because I am definitely a racist, you'd say, our cultural identity is being erased. The implication is all there, and the influence of these tactics resonate today in the form of the alt-right or whatever they're calling themselves today. Gropers or something. It's just ridiculous that everyone knows exactly what they're saying, and yet they still act offended when they're called out. And this man was given airtime and due consideration by the BBC in the interests of journalistic balance, because nothing says balance like having a fascist on your TV show. You know, just to be fair to the Nazis. We wouldn't want to come off as biased against the Nazis, would we? Anyway, this far-right political party in Britain wasn't wiped off the map because people found their ideas to be repulsive or ridiculous, because far-right politics hasn't gone away here. On the contrary, it seems people stopped voting for that party because they simply jumped ship to a different political party with a more charismatic leader who used more effective rhetoric and media manipulation. And now that party has seen itself effectively wiped out in Britain because they became too associated with the far right, and their charismatic leader started yet another party and once again drained voters towards him. This isn't just confined to political players. There are also the media cheerleaders who make excuses for them. The pundit Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings.
Facts don't care about your feelings?
Yeah, I just said that, Ben. Facts don't care about your feelings. And that's a valid statement, I guess. It's pretty benign. I mean, this seagull doesn't care about your feelings. Are you going to argue against it? But if facts don't care about your feelings, the inverse of that statement is equally true. Feelings don't care about your facts. Actually, Ben, on that point, why don't you stick around a while? We might want to come back to you later, buddy. Humans aren't perfectly rational beings. We're swayed by emotions, passions, loyalties. There's this naive idea perpetuated by people who think they're smart that debates are somehow chessboards where ideas are played out. Their arguments tested in the fires of some clinical cosmic battle of logic, that people are just vessels through which ideas conduct their cold affairs, and ultimately only the best ideas come out on top. But down here in reality, we know intuitively that more often than not, ideas come secondary to how they're presented, and this is especially the case in politics. Debate favours the charismatic speaker, and often the person who's better at expressing their ideas will come out on top, even if what they're saying is completely dumb. If you think people respond to clear, concise, rational fact more than passionate, charming, clever feelings, well, sorry, but you've been duped by someone who used rhetoric to appeal to your ego, you idiot. There's no equal footing, no free marketplace of ideas. Concepts don't sink or swim on their own merits because we're not rational beings. Things like charisma, group identity, and personal circumstances play major roles in how persuasive any given idea can be. Anybody who says that they would never be affected by rhetoric is either a liar, an idiot, or a supercomputer AI from a 1970s British science fiction TV show.
I will work it out. I shall work it out. I must.
Check and mate.
I'm using rhetoric right now. Not very effectively, but still. So when a social media company kicks someone off their platform because they've seen through the very obvious act being put on by a person who very clearly wants to spread hate, I react in two ways. The first is to celebrate this minor victory. The second is to curl into a ball of paranoid terror at the idea that these companies have accumulated an unprecedented amount of unaccountable power, and we should bring them to heel because there is basically nothing to stop them abusing this power. Continuing to abuse this power. What we're seeing at the moment is private companies offering platforms of communication on a global scale, a scale never seen before. Remember, in America, the First Amendment protects you from the government denying you your freedom of speech, but not anybody else. If you go into a restaurant and start abusing other customers, or screaming conspiracy theories about a child abuse ring being run out of the basement of the restaurant while also wielding a gun, you'll probably be banned from that place. And the same goes for social media platforms. If you break the rules, you're going to get thrown out. The line that's used against this is that in this day and age, being banned from a social media company is equivalent to being banned from using a telephone, as if it's an infringement on the right to communicate. And while I understand where this is coming from, it doesn't really equate. In the UK, you can't be banned from using a telephone, but you can have restrictions placed on your phone usage if you're found to have abused the system. There's a case of a woman who made repeated nuisance calls to the emergency services line. The ambulance service received more than 250 calls from her, and at no point during any of the calls did she require an ambulance. Although she never directly called for anybody to be hurt or killed, her actions were obviously negligent and put other people's lives at risk. She was ordered by the courts to not call the emergency services again unless she required their use. Human rights are and should be a consideration at every step in the justice system. The law in the UK provides a right to respect a person's private and family life as well as their correspondence. Now, this is what's known as a qualified right, meaning it can be interfered with, but any interference needs to be necessary and proportionate. So what's more likely is that a set of conditions will be placed on the use of a phone, as in the example I cited where this woman was prevented from unnecessarily calling the emergency services. Similar conditions can be placed on computers. People that are imprisoned for downloading indecent images of children are generally allowed to have a computer and an internet connection on release, but they will have to surrender their device for forensic examination on a regular basis. You could make the case that people who advocate hate online should have similar restrictions placed on their internet usage, by which I mean they would still have access to the internet, but wouldn't be allowed to, say, publish hateful content on social media, because you've proven that you can't be trusted to act responsibly. Some people argue that those who try to deplatform people from social media or from, say, college campuses are limiting freedom of speech, and that limiting freedom of speech is just what fascists would do. You see, in their view, the people who oppose fascism are the real fascists. That is, of course, nonsense, just absolute thought garbage. The science fiction computer brain has come unstuck trying to process Popper's paradox. Here's noted linguist and social activist Noam Chomsky dismantling that argument entirely in a matter of seconds.
I mean, there's some issues on which I probably agree with Hitler. No, it doesn't mean much.
Chomsky's right, of course. The Nazis built roads too. Does that mean if we build roads today, we're doing a fascism? No, that's completely dumb. It's just dumb. Nazis drank water too. Does that mean drinking water makes you a Nazi? And just as a little aside, if these people believe so much in free markets, why do they have such a problem with private companies banning them from their platforms? Why do they argue that the power and scale of government should be rolled back, but then plead for the government to step in and regulate social media? Oh, it's because they only support things when they're beneficial to them? Oh, okay, cool. Just as long as I know. Things I support, free markets. Things I oppose, monopolies. the breaking up of which requires market intervention and regulation and is ultimately against the spirit of the free market. Love those free markets, except where I don't. There may be a universal right to have access to the internet, but there's no universal human right to have a Twitter profile. Although some rumblings seem to have been made to that effect, and as you might expect, it's by the same sort of people who've had accusations of racism thrown at them. Now isn't that a coincidence? Here's British politician Nigel Farage doing just that, calling for the government to regulate social media.
We need our legislators. We need them to redefine organisations like Facebook as publishers so that they are responsible for the content that they put out.
I mentioned Mr. Farage earlier in this video by inference. He's the man who drew votes away from the fascist political party in the UK and made a campaign poster that looked like something straight out of the Third Reich. Probably because it was basically straight out of the Third Reich. I should also add that when I say he's charismatic, that's, subjective. Now, if social media regulation were to happen in somewhere like America, which is what Farage seems to be getting at, this could mean content on the site would fall under the protections of the First Amendment. Now, this is all hypothetical stuff, but it could potentially mean, in the US at least, you wouldn't be able to be banned from a social media platform for spewing racial hatred in a way that you can at the moment, because private companies aren't bound by the First Amendment. If they want to ban you for breaking the rules that they set and you sign up to those rules, well, they can ban you. But if they were regulated by the government, banning someone from the platform could potentially mean the government was interfering in your right to freedom of speech, and you wouldn't be able to be banned. It seems to be a way to try to circumvent the rules that these people keep falling foul of. Now, as far as restricting people from Facebook or YouTube or whatever social media platforms arise in the future, I'm not suggesting that we should implicitly trust the companies that own and operate them. In fact, I wouldn't trust any company to do the morally right thing ever, because companies are driven by profit. And to put it mildly, what's profitable isn't always the right thing to do. What I'm saying is that the people who complain the loudest about limitations being placed on free speech almost always have a pretty hate-filled message that they want to be able to spread and are facing pushback against that message. It's telling that a lot of these people spend more time and energy defending the right to punch down at a minority than they do defending the rights of those minorities. And they certainly don't like it when other people try to stop them from spreading their hate-filled messages. When they say they have the right to speak, what they mean is we should provide a soapbox for them and be forced to listen to what they have to say. When they complain that they're being censored, they mean they were banned from a private platform for breaking its rules. When they talk about protecting rights, they mean preserving the status quo, never wanting things to be changed because the way it's set up currently enormously benefits them personally and politically. When they say cancel culture, they mean being called out for being a prick. When they say freedom of speech, they mean freedom from consequence. Part 4. Hate speech. Are all of these people fascists? They might be. Who can say? But even if they're not, even if they genuinely believe they're free speech warriors campaigning for your God-given right to have a heated gamer moment, one side effect of their actions is that they are helping to cultivate a manure on which the mushrooms of fascism can sprout and grow and multiply and spread and consume. You might say, now hang on just a minute. The tape mouth trope has been used by loads of people. Here's Rage Against the Machine appearing with tape over their mouths. Are they fascists? Well, no, obviously not. What about Eddie Murphy in this poster for the 2011 hit comedy film 1,000 Words? Is that a fascist film? Well, it's not as bad as some of his other films, but it's not a fascist propaganda, and it's unlikely that Eddie Murphy is himself a fascist. Why? Because neither Eddie Murphy nor the members of Rage Against the Machine have espoused far-right talking points or aligned themselves with the far right. It's the context that helps us draw a conclusion. And just a little tip here, but if you're going to espouse or align with or defend far-right talking points, it might be a good idea to not pull the same publicity stunts that Hitler did. Just for the sake of optics. Actually, you know what? Keep doing it. It makes my job a lot easier. Wait, what is my job? I don't get paid for this. The overly vaunted Christopher Hitchens once used his free speech to give a free speech on free speech. I'm assuming it was a free speech for the purposes of that joke. People may have paid to listen. I don't know or care. In this speech, Hitchens says,
if everybody in North America is forced to attend at school training in sensitivity on Holocaust awareness and is taught to study the final solution, if that's the case with everybody, as it more or less is, and one person gets up and says, you know what, this Holocaust, I'm not sure it even happened. In fact, I'm pretty certain it didn't. Indeed, I begin to wonder if the only thing is that the Jews brought a little bit of violence on themselves. That person doesn't just have a right to speak. That person's right to speak must be given extra protection, because what he has to say must have taken him some effort to come up with, might contain a grain of historical truth, might in any case give people to think about why do they know what they already think they know? How do I know that I know this, except that I've always been taught this and never heard anything else?
And this is a very fine stance to take, surely. The person Hitchens is referring to here is the English historian and noted Holocaust denier David Irving, whose work on Holocaust denial was scrutinised in an English court of law and found to be severely lacking. It became apparent that Irving had deliberately skewed evidence in his work to fit the narrative of Holocaust denial. This distortion of facts was attributed to, among other things, Irving's anti-Semitic beliefs and biases. His Holocaust denial was less about searching for truth and more about creating his own truth, one which could be used to fuel and legitimize anti-Semitism around the world. Yet Hitchens says he'd be happy to defend this. He says something's worth defending because it must have taken some effort to come up with. Okay, I'm sure it took a lot of effort, but so did writing Lord of the Rings. It doesn't mean any of it can be defended as a legitimate source of history. Hitchens' other criteria for defending the work is that it may contain a grain of truth. But in this instance, the central core of the theory and the evidence that was used to support it was found to be conclusively false. The Holocaust did happen. Hitchens' grain of truth didn't exist. Can it still be defended? What about when you balance it against the fuel it gives to neo-Nazis? In an article for the Los Angeles Times, Hitchens himself weighs up the Irving case, writing, "It's not too much to say that by the end of the trial, the core evidence for the Holocaust had been tested and found to be solid." Now this was 5 years before he gave that speech in which he says Irving's views must be protected because there may be a grain of truth to them. He says that to his audience, knowing that Irving had been found to be conclusively wrong about the Holocaust. I'm not sure how you can square this circular reasoning. A lot of these classical liberal arguments seem to pivot on everyone playing by the same rules, and it being a fair and just world in which ideas sink or swim on their own merit. They wring their hands and say they're concerned about freedom of speech, but generally speaking, it only ever seems to be the freedom of speech of bigots and Nazis that they're interested in. Irving's now considered a martyr-like figure in fascist circles. He's seen as someone who speaks truth to power, when a more accurate description might be to say he speaks lies to morons. And yet Hitchens still steps up to bat for him, knowing he's defending all of this fabrication. That's not quite what I'd call liberty. Actually, this is an old argument. The difference between liberty and license. That is to say, the freedom to do anything you like versus actually doing anything you like. For the poet and philosopher John Milton, liberty was a beautiful thing worth defending, but license was an abominable thing to be despised. Having freedom was great, abusing that freedom, not so much. Milton wrote the Areopagitica, one of the earliest and most central sacred texts of the English liberal tradition, a screed against government censorship, a phlegmy battle cry in defence of freedom of speech. Ah yes, truly this is one of the great central pillars of liberalism. Oh, unless you were a Catholic, in which case you don't deserve those rights. That might sound like a bit of a weird stipulation to our ears, even contradictory to the principles Milton was otherwise vigorously espousing. But for Milton, Catholics posed the ultimate threat to liberty. I don't want to get too bogged down in 17th century English history, but let's just say that Milton believes that if Catholics took control of the country, it would mean the beginning of an age of tyranny. So he figured that freedom of speech was absolutely something worth fighting for, but should be denied those who he thought would seek to strip away those freedoms. From basically the outset of the liberal tradition in England, there's always been an accompanying set of limitations designed to protect the freedoms themselves from being dismantled. This is basically what Karl Popper was saying only 300 years earlier, only with, a hell of a lot more prejudice against Catholics. Another example. In 2016, a man named Mark Meacham posted a video to YouTube of him teaching a dog to do a Nazi salute and respond to a phrase that riffed on the deaths of millions of Jews. Very funny. He was subsequently arrested and later convicted for being grossly offensive, which is apparently a crime here. Should Meacham have been prosecuted for this? Personally, I don't think so. It was a very dumb thing to do and extremely insensitive. I mean, that's not under dispute. We're not talking springtime for Hitler here in terms of pastiching Nazis, but it's pretty clear from the context that it was a joke with no malice, if not thought, behind it. And that's the important thing. Being offensive in and of itself isn't really an issue. You can make a joke about the Holocaust, but if you don't get it right, you risk offending and upsetting a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily make you an anti-Semite. It's the context and the intent that matter. Of course, context can change. That Meacham chose to align himself with far-right figures who came to his defense during the trial, people who genuinely push campaigns of hatred, doesn't really help his case. I personally would have rather gone at it alone than accept the support of such people, but that's just me. I talked about this a little bit more in my last video about joke arbitration syndrome, and there's a link in the description below if you want to watch it. So both Irving and Meacham have been accused of committing and even prosecuted for hate speech crimes. Irving's work on the Holocaust is outright banned in Germany, France and Belgium, and he went to prison in Austria. Why? Because in those countries, Holocaust denial is classed as hate speech. What is hate speech? Well, in a nutshell, it's a set of laws that are designed to protect certain groups of people, usually people who have a characteristic that makes them a marginalized minority in society. Attacking a person or group, either in writing or verbally or sometimes symbolically, on the basis of their protected characteristic is punishable by law. So that's things like a person's race, religion, sexuality, gender, disability. Hold on, wouldn't you know it? Those are all the same kinds of categories of people that the Nazis specifically targeted and persecuted and sent to labour and death camps. What a coincidence! It makes me scratch my head. It's almost like there's been an attempt to enshrine in law protections for people who have historically been demonised and decimated by fascists. Should we be concerned that there is an official version of history mandated by the government that has to be followed and any deviation from the established line can be punished? Undoubtedly. I also think we should be very careful about how hate speech laws are applied, if at all. But I'd also acknowledge that there are pretty good reasons for having those laws in the first place. They're ultimately there to protect people who need it. I look forward to a future where these laws can be repealed because the world has progressed to a point where there's absolutely zero chance of Holocaust denial posing a threat to Jewish people. But until then, until people stop taking this theory seriously and using it to promote hatred, I can see some justification for these laws. A lot of these so-called free speech warriors haven't really done anything to defend freedom of speech. In fact, you could argue they've actually had the opposite effect, that they've poisoned the public perception of free speech, turning it into a shield from behind which they can say anything they like and be protected from any and all consequence. Take Canadian academic Jordan Peterson, for instance, who shot to fame for not wanting to use the preferred pronouns of trans people. Paladin of free speech, right? Except he then went on to develop a blacklist of academics he deemed to be politically undesirable in an attempt to silence entire fields of academia. You'd think a free speech warrior would want to protect the rights of the most marginalised, to ensure that all voices are heard on an equal platform. Instead, they use their platform to undermine and insult minority voices at every turn, and have helped to reinforce a culture that makes it more difficult for the most marginalised voices in society to speak up, whether they be trans people, people of colour, immigrants, you name it. When these people see other members of their group getting bullied and harassed on and offline, they can think to themselves, I better not voice my opinion, or else that might be me next. And they enact a self-censorship. They don't have to be silenced if they're too afraid to speak in the first place. Of course, you could say the same about Nazis. Well, that's probably a good thing. Professor Jordan Peterson doesn't like hate speech laws, or in fact any laws that restrict freedom of speech. Well, apart from all the laws restricting freedom of speech that we already have, but we'll get into that in a little while. No, Peterson blames the creation of these laws on what he calls the postmodern Marxists who have infiltrated all levels of society and are enacting their malicious policies that help people and protect vulnerable members of our society. He sees these laws as an attack on freedom of speech. The authoritarian left, he says, does not attack free speech because it does not like it. It attacks free speech because it fears it. Now, if that isn't projection, well, it is projection. This is a guy who created a fucking blacklist and whose brand new social media site ThinkSpot has already imposed a sweeping series of restrictions on the use of speech on its members. Want to post a meme? Nope, that's banned. Want to make a succinct point? Well, you can't. Want to partake in a little defamation, obscenity, pornography, terrorism, cyberstalking, doxing, transacting in harmful or illicit goods, brigading, spam, impersonating, or multiple account abuse? Ooh, that's a big no on Thonksplorge. So much freedom of speech. Would hate speech laws work in a place like America? Wouldn't they be in direct contravention of the First Amendment? Well, that's the prevailing view taken today, but it doesn't always appear to have been the case. In fact, there's a precedent set by the Supreme Court itself. This video is too long already, so you can read more about Bohanese. Thanks, Google. Versus Illinois in the description below. But basically, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld a prosecution for what was effectively a hate speech ruling. Somebody attacked a person verbally based on the colour of that person's skin, and this was determined to be libelous against a group of people who share the same characteristic. That is to say, a racist was prosecuted for saying racist things in America. But subsequent decisions taken by the Supreme Court have basically ignored this ruling, papering over it as if it never happened. What's that? We made a decision that could strengthen the position of black people? Let's just shovel that one under the carpet. The official position now is that while the Supreme Court acknowledges that speech can be harmful, it doesn't consider it the government's place to determine what is and isn't acceptable for public debate. Except for a whole load of reasons we're about to get into right now. Part 5. Just how free is my speech? Well, that depends where you live, of course. In America, freedom of speech is enshrined as the first and, by inference, the most important amendment to the Constitution. It reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But we already know that freedom of speech comes with its own set of limitations, and none of these are listed in the Constitution. In fact, some of the other amendments to the Constitution have been interpreted as being direct conflict with the First Amendment. You see, free speech, even in America where it's vaunted as sacred, isn't exactly fully free all of the time. You can't lie under oath in court, or use it as a defense to obstruct justice. You can't libel or defame someone, or use free speech to cover your back while committing fraud. You can't leak government secrets or commit sedition. You famously can't shout fire in a crowded theatre. You can't say you're going to beat someone up or kill them. You can't lie about a product you're selling. You're not allowed to create, distribute, or possess child pornography, even though other types of pornography are protected by freedom of speech laws. You can't breach copyright by passing off someone else's work as your own. You can't incite other people to commit violence or suicide. You can't interfere with or jeopardize a fair trial. You can't be obscene. In the 1950s, you could be brought to trial for expressing communist viewpoints on the grounds of being anti-American. Right now, the Trump administration are alleged to be censoring scientific information on climate change. You can be prosecuted during wartime for saying things that would normally be fine during peacetime. You forfeit certain freedom of speech rights if you're put in prison, or if you join the military, or even if you work as a lawyer or a prison warden. If you're a potential immigrant to the US, the government can bar you from entering the country based on things you say, even if that speech would have been protected as soon as you'd been naturalized. As a student, you're considered to be in the care of the government while you're at school, and therefore you're not allowed to promote illegal drug use, even if you're not in school at the time, as was determined in 2007 when a student was suspended after he set up a banner reading, "Bong hits for Jesus," at an event across the road from the school. In that instance, the Supreme Court determined that the First Amendment does not prevent educators from suppressing student speech that is reasonably viewed as promoting illegal drug use. So we salute you, Bong hits for Jesus guy. Your banner lies eternally preserved for posterity at the Washington Museum. Oh, it's just closed forever. Oh well. all these limitations and exceptions to free speech in the land of the free? Well, yes. And for the most part, you don't hear anybody complaining about these existing limitations because a lot of them make sense. In fact, in spite of the First Amendment, which also guarantees the freedom of press, the United States currently ranks 48th in the World Press Freedom Index, just behind Romania and one place ahead of Senegal. It's behind Chile, whose government at the time of writing this script at least is in the process of murdering its own people and piling up bodies in the street. So, is America really the bastion of free expression? Yeah, they got freedom of speech, except for what, like 50 exceptions? It doesn't say that in the Constitution. In fact, you might as well throw the Constitution in the bin. In his book On Liberty, the English philosopher and social reformer John Stuart Mill argued that there ought to exist the fullest liberty of professing and discussing as a matter of ethical conviction any doctrine, however immoral it may be considered. Roughly, that means he thinks that people should be free to say anything they want to say, that really it's the only way to push arguments to their logical limits and for society to progress. But he also introduced what is known as the harm principle, which placed the following limitation on freedom. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So even the godfather of classical liberalism, a registered trademark, concedes that in order to have freedom of speech, there must be limitations placed on speech. You have the freedom to say what you want as long as it doesn't cause harm to others. Wait a minute, John Stuart Mill wants to limit freedom of speech? I guess the classical liberals are the real fascists. Actually, Mill was pretty racist, so, the point is we've essentially arrived once again back at Popper's paradox.
But when we say, yay, free speech except where it can harm people, what exactly constitutes harm?
Part 6. Surprisingly, words have consequences. In 2017, a man went into a mosque in Quebec City, Canada, and began indiscriminately shooting at the people inside. He killed 6 and injured 19 others. As part of their investigation, police looked for clues as to why this person might have done what they did, and why in particular they might have targeted Muslims. They looked at a list of Twitter accounts that the shooter had been viewing in the lead-up to the attack, and it contained a whole host of people like Alex Jones, Stefan Molyneux, Gavin McInnes, and Paul Joseph Watson. That's funny. Those are some of the same people who are continually complaining that they're being silenced, and who regularly spew anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, far-right rhetoric. It's really strange that these are the kinds of people a racist murderer would regularly check in on for updates. Also on the killer's top 20 list was Steve Bannon, the former CEO of Breitbart News, which you'll also remember is the far-right news organization from earlier in this video, who leaked the alleged list of reasons for Facebook banning those people. Breitbart News' official Twitter account was also on the list of the most viewed accounts by the shooter, by the way, and in addition to everything I just mentioned was also the organization behind the video where most of those taped mouth photographs were pulled from earlier. Isn't it grand how everything connects? Almost like a network, some might say. But wait, who's that at the top of the list? Whose Twitter feed did the Quebec mosque shooter check 93 times in the month leading up to the shooting, more than any other feed on this list compiled by the police? Why, it's none other than the former editor-at-large of Breitbart News, Ben Shapiro. Hello again, Ben. Now, I'm not suggesting that you're personally responsible for these murders and that you have blood on your hands. But it's very hard to disentangle yourself from the actions of a man who seemed to be very interested in what you had to say about Muslims, and then went and killed Muslims. When we look at John Stuart Mill's singular restriction for freedom of speech, that speech should only be limited in service of ensuring no harm, we can do so with the benefit of hindsight, looking not only at the horrors of the 20th century, but of the continually unfolding horrors of this one. Horrors that Mill probably couldn't conceive of at the time of writing on liberty. We can only imagine what he would have thought of the Holocaust. Now we're faced with a resurgence of hateful rhetoric, only it's been glossed over so that the worst bits aren't ever said out loud. They learned how to say the same things, but in such a way that gives them plausible deniability. Remember the leader of that British fascist party earlier, saying that this was the new strategy for mainstreaming literal fascist talking points? But being an outright fascist doesn't play well with the majority audience, at least at the moment. In addition to this, Mill could never have anticipated the internet, the power and influence it would give to individuals, organizations, and corporations. How, when it's never been more possible to create an informed opinion, it's also never been easier to be misinformed. There's no way Mill could have foreseen the consequences of fake news, of an onslaught of misinformation and conspiracy theories taking over the public discourse. It's not even clear that we understand how those things are affecting our society yet. In fact, when Mill writes about freedom of speech, he makes the argument that the fullest liberty of expression is required to push arguments to their logical limit, rather than the limits of social embarrassment. And I agree with that. Of course, what Mill's referring to here are the taboos around discussions Victorians were having at the time about things like suicide, gambling, sex, and contraception, not quite on the same level as genocide. Although I'm sure future generations will look back on our time on this earth and say, how quaint that all they had to argue about was whether or not we should systematically eradicate entire races of people. You see, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the subject of birth control was a serious matter, much more controversial than it is today. In the US, the Comstock laws passed by Congress in 1873 made it a crime to send contraceptives in the mail, or even information about contraceptives, or even how to go about finding information about contraceptives. The penalty was a fine or hard labor. More like the Comstock laws, am I right? Following the passage of these laws, many states enacted their own restrictions that barred dissemination of information about contraceptives. People were punished because they were expressing ideas that were considered socially unacceptable, and this was apparently not in conflict with the First Amendment. In fact, birth control was so controversial to the public discourse then that serious efforts were made to keep John Stuart Mill from being buried in Westminster Abbey because of his advocacy for limiting family size. So to me, when Mill writes about the fullest liberty of expression being required for a healthy society, it seems much more likely that he was referring to the risque topics of the Victorian age rather than perpetuating genocidal talking points and advocating racial hatred that can and does get people killed. Now, some people today argue that there should be absolutely no limitations on freedom of speech, and that even thinking of doing so is some form of modern sacrilege. That seems a bit of an extreme position to me. What if you told somebody to kill me and they did it? Would you be responsible? Well, in most countries, including the US and Britain, yes, you would. The US constitutional guarantees of free speech and free press do not allow a state to forbid or prescribe advocacy of the use of force or law violation except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or cause such action. So that's all fine and dandy. But if you tell someone to kill somebody and they do it, you are in part responsible for that outcome. But what if you just hint at killing someone? What if you continually demonize a person or group of people over a long period of time? Does that cumulative impact have any bearing on a person's motives? What if you do that and then the next day you talk about picking up a gun? I mean, you haven't specifically joined those dots right, but the implication's there. What if you do all that and you have an audience of millions? Is it almost inevitable that someone in your audience will connect those dots and pick up a gun and shoot the people you've been railing against for years? Is it, Ben? There's a term that's developed over the last few years called stochastic terrorism. I'll let Dave Pachman describe the concept because he does it better than I can.
If you've not heard the term stochastic terror, this is the idea that if you have access to forms of mass communication, like the bully pulpit of the presidency of the United States, or a big media presence, or whatever sort of mass communication method that might be, you can incite random actors to carry out violent or terrorist acts that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. What does that mean? It means that when Donald Trump says things like, the Second Amendment people maybe can find a solution if Hillary Clinton gets elected, a statement like that. Those are statements that when someone makes a statement like that, we can't specifically predict who is going to be motivated to commit an act of real-world violence when they hear that, But if you're reaching a large enough number of people, you can statistically predict that someone is going to.
This concept has been looked at in a 2017 book called The Age of Lone Wolf Terrorism. The authors of that book describe stochastic terrorism as a form of indirect enabling of terrorists and terrorism acts. They write that stochastic terrorism is the method of international recruitment used by ISIS. That is to say, ISIS deliberately influences people to commit acts of terror on their behalf and then claims responsibility for these acts, which perpetuates more instances of terror. The authors of the book also refer to people like right-wing conspiracy theorists Glenn Beck and Alex Jones as influencers and enablers of stochastic terrorism in the United States. They cite the Oakland freeway shootout in 2010, in which a man had made plans to start a revolution by traveling to San Francisco and killing people of importance at the offices of the Tides Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union. In the aftermath of the incident, it transpired that the shooter had been influenced in large part by then Fox News host Glenn Beck. In the 18 months leading up to the shooting, Beck had attacked the Tides Foundation 29 times on his show. During an interview, the shooter repeatedly instructed the interviewer to watch specific broadcasts of Beck's show for information on the conspiracy theory that drove him to pick up a gun. He also pointed to other right-wing conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones as key sources of information that inspired him. He went on to say that Beck was like a school teacher, and that he would never say anything about a conspiracy, would never advocate violence, but he'll give you every ounce of evidence that you could possibly need. Now, to go back to Ben Shapiro. Ben, I'm no big city lawyer, but with all this in mind, I'm sure a case could be made that your words, your rhetoric, informed and directly influenced the worldview of a man who went on to be a murderer, and that you could therefore, in theory, accept some of the responsibility for the deaths and injuries caused.
You didn't pick up a gun, but would the killer have picked up a gun if he hadn't been exposed to your Twitter feed?
What about if he hadn't been exposed to all those other accounts on the list? Ben, when you say things like Muslims live in open sewers, or that the civilian casualties during a war with a Muslim country don't matter, when you consistently pump out hateful content at your audience, that can all have real-world consequences. Think about it. What is the ultimate aim of your words? Did Charles Manson ever kill anyone? No. Did he directly tell people to kill anyone? No. Did he condition people who held him as a figure of authority to hate certain people that he vilified without ever actually outright stating what action should be taken? Yes. Did Charles Manson die in prison? Yes. Is Ben Shapiro exactly like Charles Manson? No. For one thing, he doesn't have a swastika tattooed on his forehead. Ben caused another stir just a few months before the release of this video when he made a statement directed at the politician Beto O'Rourke. During a town hall meeting, O'Rourke had said that he would take away the tax-exempt status from any organisation that didn't affirm gay marriage, including churches and colleges. Ben responded by saying that if Beto tried to do this, he would pick up a gun, and went on to say, "Beto O'Rourke does not get to raise my child, and if he tries, I will meet him at the door with a gun." And this caused a bit of a stink, not least because you'd think a person like Ben, whose name has previously been directly linked by police to at least one terrorist mass shooting, would know better than to make such potentially incendiary and insightful remarks. It almost feels like, no, he couldn't possibly be. Could he? What's classed as abstract advocacy of force seems to be having increasingly concrete consequences and a spiralling body count. Some private companies are taking baby steps in addressing this issue by removing the loudest and most hateful voices on their platforms, but others who peddle essentially the same vile views but just toned down enough to fly under the radar of an outright ban are able to continue to peddle their hatred. And make no mistake, there will be more deaths, and there will be a traceable line back to the rhetoric of certain individuals. The argument against stochastic terrorism is that by putting some of the blame on people's words, it diminishes the responsibility of the person who decides to pick up a gun and kill people. But here's the thing. Responsibility doesn't necessarily diminish when it's divided. In the same way a mother's love for her first child doesn't halve when she has her second. She loves both her children equally. There's no reduction of love anywhere. So too for responsibility. Yes, the person who picks up a gun is responsible for the deaths they cause, but that doesn't mean the person who inspired them to pick up the gun isn't also responsible. If there's a provable causal link between their rhetoric and a set of murders, they absolutely own some of that responsibility. There's the old story about King Henry II of England who, during a disagreement with the Archbishop of Canterbury, exclaimed out loud, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" A group of knights heard the king saying this and decided to go and rid the king of that meddlesome priest. They went over and killed the Archbishop of Canterbury. Did the king explicitly order the murder of the Archbishop? No. Would the murder have happened without his words? No. Should the king have been more careful with his words? Probably. Although if he had been more careful with his words, I wouldn't have been able to cite this as an example. But it's pretty unarguable that indirect calls to violence can be as deadly, even more deadly, than direct calls to violence. Part 7. Deplatforming. In all likelihood, the preaching of intolerance and abstract incitements to violence won't become criminal activities. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, it's almost certain that there'd be some unintended consequences if they were to happen, and nobody's suggesting that J.D. Salinger be put on trial for the murder of John Lennon. But that doesn't mean effective action can't be taken now against people whose words on the surface appear woolly and abstract, but as time passes solidify into concrete targets and consequences. One such way of taking action right now is to deplatform clear voices of hate. This means targeting people who hold hateful views, who don't play fair, and making sure that they don't have access to platforms to spread their bile around town, whether this be on university campuses, television, social media, the beer hall, you name it. If you promote intolerance and aren't prepared to engage on a level playing field, if it's clear you're not acting or arguing in good faith, you're out. And you'll have to do a lot of legwork and soul searching if you want a chance to get back in. Deplatforming voices of hate works, in spite of what those being deplatformed might say to the contrary. Oh yeah, really going to take advice on whether deplatforming works from the people who are being deplatformed. I'm pretty sure that's like rule 1 in the art of war or something. If your enemy tells you to stop doing something because it isn't working, you should probably keep doing that thing because it's definitely working. Will deplatforming work every time? No, probably not. But we've seen the evidence of its effectiveness in the form of disgraced far-right pundit Milo Yiannopoulos, another former Breitbart employee, by the way. Gee, a real trend building here. Milo has been banned from almost every major social media platform on the internet, where he was once appearing on primetime television and being hailed as the poster boy for America's far right.
I mean, you remind me like of a young, gay, alive Christopher Hitchens.
He now has trouble getting speaking gigs. His book deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars collapsed. His media influences continues to diminish. Hardly anybody listens to him anymore. He's basically gone bankrupt because he can no longer afford the lifestyle he came to expect from doing what he did. Milo's taken to using the Russian-owned social media platform Telegram, which according to him is a wasteland. He complains that nobody listens to him anymore, and that those that do listen don't give him any money. Of course, Milo claims to be the victim here, saying that he was deplatformed from Twitter for being a conservative. In reality, he was banned for inciting and engaging in targeted abuse and harassment of a black woman, the actress Leslie Jones. Now, some people say that Milo was a special case, and that his fall from grace had more to do with his own crowd turning on him for comments he made about having sex with minors than it did with any concerted effort from the left to deplatform him. Well, yeah, I actually think that argument strengthens the case for the effectiveness of deplatforming, because Milo is no longer allowed to speak even at conservative events. It wasn't just the left that deplatformed him, the right did too, and it's ruined him. But if you're not convinced by that, I suppose in the interests of fairness and the hopes of establishing some sort of trend here, we should at least look at one other example of someone who's been deplatformed and how they're faring these days. Alex Jones, who we earlier saw defined as a stochastic terrorist in an academic book, has been banned from Facebook, Twitter, Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. This means that Jones and his company can no longer use their direct influence to link people to the insane and hateful content on his website, which means there will be fewer people visiting the InfoWars store, which means less money in Alex Jones's pocket. So how's Alex Jones doing? Well, his hard-hitting journalism has landed him in several defamation suits which he continues to lose. The New York Times compiled statistics from 2 analytics companies and found that in the month after his ban, daily traffic to InfoWars and his YouTube channel dropped from an average of 1.4 million daily visitors to 715,000 daily visitors, just over half. Let's take a look at what those numbers are looking like today. Oh dear. I wonder what the daily average works out. Oh, yikes. That's like an 80% drop, isn't it? Alex said these bans would make him stronger, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Alex no longer has a direct line to people on a number of the world's most prominent social media platforms because he has shown time and again a willfulness to spread hatred, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake news. The consequences of his actions have been felt around the world, not least among the parents of the Sandy Hook school shooting victims. Jones alleged this massacre of children never happened, and that the victims were child actors. In his own words, Sandy Hook is a synthetic, completely fake with actors, in my view, manufactured. I couldn't believe it at first. I knew they had actors there clearly, but I thought they killed some real kids, and it just shows how bold they are that they clearly used actors. Not only did this cause immense distress to the parents of the children who were killed, but the parents say they've been subject to harassment and death threats from Alex Jones' followers as a direct result of the conspiracy theories he's promoted on his shows. So Alex Jones is being hit hard by deplatforming, but it's all a consequence of his own actions. He's been reduced to making guest appearances on Logan Paul's YouTube show, which is basically a low point for low points. In fact, one theory goes that in order to get around the InfoWars ban, a sister site was set up to mirror InfoWars content, or otherwise host content that would normally appear under the InfoWars banner. This site is run by the salacious B. Crumb to Jones's Jabba the Hutt, Paul Joseph Watson. The domain for this website was registered just days after Jones was banned from Twitter. We can also see other signs that deplatforming is taking its toll. At the bottom of every article on Summit News, there's a pitiful little screed begging for money, moaning about how they're being silenced by tech giants.
If you value my message, if you don't want to see it silenced, I need your support.
But that doesn't really tally with reality. The InfoWars website's still up, the Summit News website's still up, Paul Joseph Watson's still on Twitter with 1 million+ followers. All I can hear is the deafening sound of a man screaming at me and 1 million other people that he's being silenced and begging for money. Speaking of which, I think it's time for another ad break. Look at these children. Instead of donating your hard-earned money to worthy causes, please give it to me instead. It's absolutely vital that you send me your cash. Your donation can help to keep the torch of independent journalism alive. Journalists who bring you hard-hitting content like this.
They think they can't get you. They'll torture the living hell out of you. A lot of people, they'll be like a 100-foot praying mantis trying to break your will. They'll be like you'll be on a spaceship with elves, people all chained up. They've already died, they've got their souls. In these dimensions, there's lots of like retarded gremlins running around. All this is in lore. Little gremlins, they just want to break stuff, attack people. They want to hurt you, they're jealous of you.
We rely on your cash to sustain our wealthy lifestyles. Your money is what keeps my boss in Rolexes, and without it, I might get shouted at. We will literally not be able to survive without your money, and all the money we already have. So please, give generously and give often, because the more money you give to me, the richer I'll be. Thank you. So, we know deplatforming works. It works really well, actually. And this isn't a ban on speech, by the way. None of these people have gone to prison for the things they've said. They're just facing the consequences of their own intolerance. It's a way of turning down the volume on the most vitriolic voices out there so that they aren't able to abuse massive global platforms in order to spread hatred. It's not much, but it's kind of the best workaround we have at the moment. People remain free to say whatever they want within the bounds of existing laws without being punished by the state for voicing their opinions. But anyone who does so must also accept that everyone else on the planet isn't obligated to listen to their bile, and we will take action to ensure the most hateful voices are not promoted, because we know where that hate can lead. If you want to stand on a soapbox on the street corner and talk about immigration, fine. But if you use immigration as a cover for spreading racism, people are within their rights to gather round you and drown your voice out. This isn't infringing your freedom of speech. If you want to rent a space to hold a rally for your fascist political party, people are within their rights to complain to the owners of that space to get the event cancelled. This isn't infringing your free speech. If you want to use a social media platform to spread hateful propaganda, people are within their rights to try to get your account disabled. This isn't infringing your free speech. If you want to lie, you should expect to be corrected. This isn't infringing your free speech. The goal isn't to limit expression, ideas, or discussion. The goal is to counteract those sneaky snakes who want to spread hateful ideas that have a proven track record of getting people killed. The poet William Blake said, "Without contraries is no progression," and I believe it. It means that we can only move forward if ideas are allowed to clash and meld. If you want to discuss things, that's great, but there need to be ground rules that everyone plays by. The playing field needs to be more level. Ideas of hate are not presented rationally because they are not rational. Therefore, there's not much point trying to rationally argue against them. These arguments of hate are bolstered by lies, misinformation, prejudice, and cloaked in concern, patriotism, and pseudoscience. They tap into things in the psyche that aren't beholden to reason. The Marxist theorist Rosa Luxemburg said that freedom means the freedom for the one who thinks differently, and that quote is often used by human-frog hybrids to bolster the argument for not placing restrictions on speech as they wipe a Johnny Walker-scented tear of pride away. What they often fail to acknowledge, either through design or ignorance, is that Luxemburg, much like Mill and Milton, added a caveat to her statement, namely that the effectiveness of freedom vanishes when it becomes a special privilege. Well, what is a special privilege if not an expectation that the rules everyone else has to play by don't apply to you? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so if you say something censorious, you can't really be surprised when there's blowback. If you promote intolerance, expect to not be tolerated. If you don't play by the rules and try to take advantage of the game, expect to be kicked out of the game. Remember, the Nazis moaned for years that they were being silenced. In reality, they had an ever-expanding platform, and when they got into power, completely dominated that platform. Special privilege indeed. Part 8. Should we limit free speech? AKA, please tell me what to think so I can pass your opinion off as my own. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, or so the saying goes. But surely you have to be willing to act on that vigilance. I mean, what's the point of keeping watch if you're not going to do anything when the warning sounds? Otherwise, the price of freedom is the chance of being shot to death because some dweeb on the internet whipped a maniac into a paranoid frothing rage. Ultimately, the question, should we limit free speech, isn't particularly helpful because it's almost meaningless. We already limit free speech in a whole toolbox full of ways, and very few people are arguing for these existing limits to be dismantled. Are these limitations of speech fixed forever in perpetuity, or do we accept that as our standards change over time, the laws should adapt to reflect those changes? Well, in America at least, the clue's in the name. The right to freedom of speech is an amendment to the Constitution. They added it later after a lot of fierce debate, and they continued to amend the Constitution throughout history as the world changed around the country. The most recent amendment to the Constitution was ratified as recently as 1992. That's 1 year after Disney's Beauty and the Beast came out for all the old people watching out there. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I absolutely do not think the responsibility to determine who should and shouldn't be allowed a platform should fall entirely to private companies. That, to me, is terrifying, really deeply dystopian stuff, and we should definitely do something about that because profit margins should not be the driving force behind that kind of action. But how do we determine what is hateful, what is harmful? How do we know that the motives of the people trying to deplatform someone are pure? How do we effectively stop hate speech in a way that can't be circumvented and doesn't hurt marginalized people or minority voices or ideas? These are incredibly difficult things to try and do, and I can't even begin to propose ways of actually implementing something like that. It needs to be something that we work out together, not the sole remit of the government or the private sector. Remember, just because people complain about things someone says doesn't mean that person deserves to be deplatformed. And it doesn't mean that deplatforming is the only tactic that can effectively put the kibosh on hate speech. But in the absence of a better system, the only real option we have at the moment is to try to levy collective pressure on these companies to force them to remove the most hateful voices from its platform. When people like Paul Joseph Watson or Ben Shapiro or Stefan Molyneux make a statement that portrays any given minority in an unfavourable light, the effect of their rhetoric is almost unquantifiable. But when one pumps out things like hateful content, lies by omission, misinformation, conspiracy theories, falsehoods, distortion of facts, and racial prejudice to an increasingly large audience, it becomes a statistical certainty that you will incite or partially incite someone to harm other people. This effect gets compounded when you have a number of people or organisations doing the same or similar things, and this is compounded once again by it happening day after day, month after month, year after year. My argument is that Mill's harm principle and Popper's intolerance paradox have to be applied to this model, a suffusion of both theories to protect people from a new and expanding threat. I'm aware that what I'm proposing here would be insanely difficult and potentially quite expensive to implement, but that doesn't feel like a good excuse to not do it, because if we don't address the problem of people promoting intolerance, more people will die. The bottom line is this: if you're going to be racist or bigoted or spread hateful or extremist views or lies which have a track record of killing millions of people in the past or are inspiring terrorists to kill people today, don't be surprised when people want to stop you from doing that, because we have seen where that leads. Your intolerance should not be tolerated. We can discuss your ideas as long as you're open and honest and play by the rules. If you choose to not play by the rules, you don't get to play. And if you come to the defense of those people under the guise of protecting freedom of speech while actually having zero interest in defending the rights of the people who are actually marginalized by society, don't be surprised when you're accused of being an enabler of intolerance. There's an old saying that goes something like this: history might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme sometimes. And if you have even a basic grasp of history, you should understand that we're only ever a couple of syllables away from forming a couplet. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you made it this far, well done you. I didn't intend for this video to be as long as it is, so it took a little bit longer than I'd anticipated to get out. If you like the video, maybe you should click the like button. I won't force you to, it's just an idea. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can click the subscribe button too, so that when I release the next one, which hopefully won't take as long to get out, then you'll know straight away. And if you didn't like the video, you can click the dislike button too, because this is a democracy. It makes no difference to me which button you click. Ultimately, it still adjusts the YouTube algorithm in my favour, so go wild. I'd like to say a big thank you to Twitter user JSO Felix for their insight into legal restrictions that can be placed on people who have broken the law and the balancing act required to make sure their human rights aren't infringed. I'd also like to thank all the people who left a comment along the lines of freedom of speech should never be restricted under any circumstances without actually watching my video. Congratulations, guys. Not only have you made fools of yourselves because free speech is already pretty limited no matter where you live, you also just gave the thumbs up to child pornography, either intentionally or otherwise. Thank you for falling for my calculated incendiary video title. You have played right into my hands. Finally, I'd like to thank all of my Patreon supporters, who I will now list.